there were all kinds of ways in which the previous administration, the Biden administration, put all kinds of unnecessary and unjust burdens on these business people, and they're hoping to get some relief under Trump. But of course, the fact that there's now this lifeline means that someone like Trump is holding it. And so even if he does offer them some escape, it's another form of control that he has over them. Business people are not the rulers, they're the pawns. They are caught in terrible dilemmas, manipulated by politicians of whichever stripe, and we all pay the price for it. We all suffer for it.
On the side of just the average American citizen, the more you stand up in support of the freedom of American businesses and oppose controls, whoever's trying to impose them or threatening them, whether a Democrat, Republican, whether it's Biden, Trump, if you actually stand up for it, you're giving the business people some element of support and hopefully some encouragement for them to speak up.
On the morning of March 11th, CEOs from top American firms met in private to discuss their profession. When news of Trump's tariffs against Mexico and Canada broke, though, they were in shock and dismayed. Later that same day, they attended a meeting of the Business Roundtable with President Trump himself, but none raised questions, let alone any criticisms of the tariffs. That is what the Wall Street Journal reported in an eye-opening story by Chip Cutter and Lauren Thomas on March 12th. And the question that it raises is, what explains the seeming unwillingness of these titans of industry to express themselves, to speak truth to power? Aren't they, according to one popular narrative, supposed to be plutocrats, whom the left says are now in charge of the government? Well, that is the big question that we will be discussing on this podcast. My name is Ben Bayer. I'm a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. With me, senior fellow Onkar Ghate. Welcome, Onkar.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, so let me say something about, you put this as an eye-opening story of why it leaps out, and particularly leaps out in the context of this, the as you put it, a narrative saying that what we have now is a government run by businessmen, or rich businessmen, rich, powerful businessmen. What stands out from the story, and it shouldn't surprise anyone who knows something about business, is that so many of the CEOs of America's largest companies, Target, Walmart, Apple, and so on, are opposed to these tariffs. And a tariff is a tax, so they're opposed to the government, so in this case, the federal government, the Trump administration, massively increasing taxes on their businesses and on all the trade and transaction that the businesses engage in. And particularly for any large company, it becomes international. And that's true even if it starts out like Apple, that it's first an American company and really growing in the American market, or a Facebook. They become worldwide players, which means they have trade across the globe. And the threat of these taxes on foreign transactions, that is, of an American trading with somebody in another country, that, now you're going to pay a huge cut to the government when you do that. That obviously impacts their businesses from a negative side. And so that so many of them, particularly when we're looking at the really rich, big companies, that so many would be opposed to the tariffs, can't be surprising to anybody who knows something about economics. And so that they'll talk behind closed doors that this is a destructive economic policy, it's going to hurt American businesses. And if you're hurting the biggest of American businesses, you're going to hurt the American economy. That they would say that in private shouldn't surprise anybody. What should be surprising is, but they won't say any of that in public, and they won't oppose or even mildly criticize some of Trump's policies. And that's not what it looks like if you're really in charge, and if you're really the one dictating what's happening and what the policies are going to be. So for anyone who thinks there's some plausibility to, now the government's run by the rich and powerful businessmen of America, this story and with what's happening with the tariffs should be really like, can I integrate that with what's actually happening in regard to tariffs? And I don't think you can.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other details that are coming out from the business press confirming all of this. So, for example, the fellow who ran the first meeting that I mentioned, the one where the CEOs expressed shock and dismay about the news of the tariffs, it was a Yale professor, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, and he reported separately, told NPR that 70%, due to an informal poll that he did at this meeting, 70% of the CEOs at this meeting were concerned about the economic effect of the tariffs. 80% of them reported apologizing to their various international partners for the policies of the Trump administration, which were making it more difficult for them to do business together. And I mean, so that's somewhat anecdotal. We don't know everybody who was at the meeting or how representative it is. So, take the data of that particular poll with a grain of salt, but there's plenty of other stories that have come to light in recent weeks detailing really the terrible predicament that these tariffs have placed business leaders in. So I'll cite some of these details. There was a Wall Street Journal report on March 16th, a story by Hannah Mao, Sarah Nassauer, talks about how major retailers like Walmart, Target, Home Depot have to go back to the drawing board to secure their supply chains. They have to either negotiate with their overseas suppliers to basically take a hit where they offer the retailer a discount, knowing that the prices are going to go up, so they can try to keep the prices level, at least for a little while, for their domestic customers. Others, when they're not able to negotiate those discounts, then have to shift production out of a country like China, say, to other countries like Southeast Asia. They're otherwise dealing with just massive uncertainty about where their supplies are going to come from. So there's the same Wall Street Journal story talked about one particular flour supplier in the United States, buys flours for retail purposes. Now, a lot of our flours come from Colombia in South America. And Trump was threatening them with 25% tariffs if they didn't accept expatriation flights. And so they had to work overnight to find is there a way they can negotiate cost sharing? Is there a way they can get alternate suppliers? In the end, it didn't happen, and they felt all that work was for nothing. And of course, who knows what will happen at the end of the month? In other cases, they just have to pass on price raises. Costco's decided to do this apparently for a lot of its products. More than that, so Wall Street Journal, in another report, March 14th, by Patrick Thomas, talks about how some of these industries, some of these retailers, especially in grocery produce, they operate on really, really thin profit margins. They can scarcely afford to deal with these kinds of battles, the kind of uncertainty that comes from not knowing where their supplies are going to come from. I mean, we get most of our produce in the United States from Mexico, and Mexico is, of course, one of the biggest targets for the tariffs that Trump has been threatening. Some retailers have just decided to start stockpiling inventory. This is another Wall Street Journal report, March 24th, by Liz Young. If you know anything about supply chains, one of the innovations economically with supply chains in the recent decades has been just-in-time inventory to keep costs down, not to be left with more goods that you could possibly sell. They go bad on the shelf or whatever. The tariffs are now basically putting this to an end, and they're now starting to adopt what they're calling just-in-case inventory. But of course, the cost of that is they may end up with a lot of unsold goods. And looming over all of this, of course, is the dramatic uncertainty that comes from, okay, even if you don't need, even if you're not a manufacturer who needs imports to build your product, or you're not a retailer who needs to sell foreign products, even if you're a domestic manufacturer, you may still need to export your products. And then you have to worry about the possibility of the threat of tariff retaliation. This is something that Tesla privately expressed concern about to the Trump administration, knowing that it would likely be targeted if foreign countries decide to retaliate with tariffs of their own if we get into a trade war, which it now looks like we are beginning to get into.
And this whole environment and you said a few times the uncertainty involved here. The idea that if businessmen were in charge of the government, that this is what you would have, that they thrive on uncertainty, is, again, it's crazy to think that. Part of why it's most business leaders will be against this tariffs and so-called trade wars is that they plan and act long term. They think of investment in terms of years and really decades. If they're opening new stores, expanding to a new country, getting into a new line of business, yeah, it might be unprofitable for 1 or 2 years, but we see this as a long-term investment, and they're involved in long-term strategy. And if the whole business environment can change and basically change on a whim, so part of here that it's the president who's in charge of tariffs, not Congress, that moves much more deliberately and slowly. And then if they want to change, it's again slow to change. But here that it's 1 week there's going to be a 25% tariff, and then next week I'm going to double it, and then, oh no, maybe I'm going to suspend all of them, and so on. No business can do any planning, any strategizing, any investment decisions in that kind of environment. So part of the cost here, and which is a real cost but not easily seen, is all the things and all the trade and investment and strategies that won't be implemented because the businesses are, well, I don't know, I can't figure out if we should do this or not, because, well, if there's a 25% tariff now put on some Canadian suppliers that we would be using, or suppliers in Mexico, it wouldn't be profitable to do this anymore, and I have no idea what's going to happen. And so they start just either hoarding their cash, but just not investing in things that they would otherwise invested in if there was some stability. So tariffs as taxes are bad enough, but when it's then the threat of, and they're going to keep changing, so you won't know what your tax rate is. And so the idea that a business, yeah, that's a kind of environment that I want to function in, and this is what we would be pushing and supporting if we had political power. It's, again, I in the end think that, like, that's a crazy view to think that. So something else is going on than the idea that, oh, somehow business or the big business has seized the machinery of government.
Yeah, and just to amplify that point, audience may notice that all of the stories I just cited were from the Wall Street Journal. I didn't even bother mentioning similar stories that are coming from places from the New York Times. But the reason that I wanted to focus just on those is, I mean, the Wall Street Journal is itself traditionally seen as the journal of record for business and industry, the voice of business and industry. And if you had any reason to doubt their account, the reason that's usually offered for doubting anything the journal says is that they have a pro-business bias. Okay, well, but then what do you take from the fact that the journal with the pro-business bias, if it's that, is seemingly pretty worried about the effect of these tariffs, to the point that it's reporting so extensively on the problems that industry is facing because of them? They're supposed to be the voice of the plutocrats. Does it sound like they're actually in control? Does it sound like they, not just representatives of business, but I mean members of the industry themselves? I mean, it's the big business of multimedia. Does it sound like they're the ones who are actually calling the shots, or does it sound like they're desperately trying to plead with whoever it is that's in power to take their boots off their necks? And part of the reason that I've stressed the stories that I have, I mean, we haven't even touched on the issue of the effect of tariffs on consumers, which is, of course, also totally relevant to comment on. But Onkar, you talked about the detrimental effects of uncertainty on long-term business planning. And part of what we stress at the Ayn Rand Institute is standing up for the most productive, greatest ability individuals in society. And that's what business people are. So it's really important to stress the impact these kinds of measures are having on the most productive people. These international traders have to coordinate really delicately integrated supply chains for the sake of bringing exotic international products to our markets and to our tables. And when you introduce something like tariffs, which, as you say, are a tax, into this equation, you're forcefully interfering with their effort. It's in effect a kind of central planning. It makes rational economic calculation impossible. And so, of course, they're going to object, if they're rational, to this kind of interference.
I'm old enough to remember a time when there wasn't nearly the level of global trade that there is now. And so when I was growing up, there wasn't produce from all over the globe in the grocery store, or if there was, there's much less. It was so much more expensive. And the part of globalization and the increase in trade, the specialization, the decrease in the cost of shipping, both by sea and by air, has made it possible that we take it for granted now that, oh yeah, I'm going to buy avocados from Mexico, blueberries from Peru, and so on, and at a price that the average American can afford. And again, it won't be, the long-term effects are harder to see, but what the whole environment of trade wars will be is just a shrinking of global commerce. And the effect will be, you just won't be buying things that you otherwise would have and could have. And that's it's important to hold. They're taxes. That's what taxes do. Taxes are taxes on production, on people who want to trade. And there's a myth to call them tariffs is to try to suggest, well, this is the whole cost is going to be imposed on foreigners, and we Americans are going to get rich, and that's part of Trump's whole rhetoric. But if you hold that they're a tax, then you're taxing a transaction between a foreigner and an American. An American is buying things from other countries, and if you put a tax on it, you're damaging him. You're damaging him, his ability to trade, his ability to run his business. You're destroying wealth that he would have created. So if people think of, well, the Republicans are for lower taxes, they're not anymore. If they ever were, they're certainly not under Trump. When he says that he loves tariffs, what it means is he loves taxes. And what that does, a tax is a tax ultimately on production. These clearly are taxes on production, and they're destructive of business. So from that perspective, that it's businessmen are clamoring for this and driving this, they're the ones in control, and what they're doing is taxing their own businesses and their own production. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense why any of them would support it, why they wouldn't oppose it. And yet, again, to go back to the hook at the beginning of the episode, when they come face to face with the politicians who are foisting these tariffs on them, the story seems to be they don't say anything. They don't say anything at a place like that business roundtable. They don't speak up in public. That same Yale professor whom I mentioned also took another poll at his meeting, asking the CEOs in attendance, what would it take for you to speak up about this? And 44% of them reported not until stocks fell 20%. 22% of them said not until stocks fell 30%. So things would have to get really bad before they started to publicly criticize the policies of the administration. Why would it take so much? Why are they reluctant to say anything about it now? Well, the author of that story, Chip Cutter, was in an interview, and I think he came to a reasonable conclusion. Here I will quote him. They're scared. They're worried they're going to be targeted. They're worried their businesses are going to suffer. And when you look at the whole array of threats that are currently aligned against various of these CEOs and their various of their interests, you have some reason to think, yeah, this is why they might be scared. So just consider some of the CEOs who were in attendance at this business roundtable meeting with President Trump. And Onkar, I'm going to go on a rant here, so just jump in anytime you want. So Tim Cook of Apple in attendance at that business roundtable meeting. His company is currently facing an antitrust suit that was filed by the Biden administration, which Cook has there's some reason to think he's hoping the Trump administration is going to drop it, but he hasn't dropped it yet. And in fact, he's pursued still aggressively. He's aggressively pursued antitrust lawsuits against other big tech companies like Google. So Cook has to worry. If I say anything now, is this suit just going to be continued against me or even doubled down on? Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase or Jan Fraser of Citigroup, big banks. On the campaign trail, President Trump proposed that there should be a cap on interest rates for credit cards, which is a price control. And now both houses of Congress have bills pending to implement that proposal, which he can sign. So CEOs of Chase and Citigroup have to think, are we going to be targeted with this price control, an important source of revenue for our businesses? Or the continued uncertainty about the tariffs themselves. Many of these industries are applying for exemptions so that they can skirt around the tariffs that are otherwise on products they need to build what they build. Mary Barra of GM, who was in attendance at this business roundtable meeting, has to worry about, is she going to be able to renew the exemption she's already gotten on steel tariffs at the end of the month on April 2nd, when a whole new series of tariffs goes into effect. Or Albert Bourla of Pfizer has to worry about Trump's threats to impose tariffs on international production of drugs, of life-saving drugs that Americans need. Does he need to now shift production to the U.S. and make prices go even higher even when people already complain that drug prices are too high? There was a New York Times report on March 24th about hundreds of letters that have recently poured into the White House from various industries, all begging for exemptions and exceptions to these tariffs. So they're coming to court, pleading and bowing before the power, the powers that be, to demand some kind of exemption. They often make excuses like claiming to be victims of other countries' tariffs. And even in recent days, we're recording this on Tuesday, March 25th. Just yesterday, there was some moderate positive sentiment on the stock market in the hopes that the tariffs wouldn't be as bad coming out on April 2nd as the president originally threatened. Why is it that they think they won't be bad? Well, because they're only going to apply to the 15 worst offenders, the dirty 15 countries where he thinks American products are not given a fair enough deal in their market. At the same time, President, in announcing that, also says there will be fewer exemptions, but says we can, quote unquote, be flexible about it, which is more uncertainty, which is more of an implicit threat, again, that if you don't come begging to me, if you don't keep in accord with my policies, and if you criticize me, then, well, I guess we won't be flexible anymore.
And there's a special aspect of it with Trump and the Trump administration of that. I think it should be understandable why they're so scared of speaking up. So I don't think it's as though this is the first administration that goes after its opponents and singles out people. But Trump takes a special relish in it, does it openly, and does it as a matter of course. So to give a contrast, in the financial crisis, the government went after the healthier banks. Do you want to take out? Do you want to take government handouts? And we want you to, because we want to show the whole the industry we're bailing them out and we're going to stabilize it and there's not going to be problems. And the better bank said, well, we don't need a bailout. We don't want to be lumped in with these ones that have made bad investments and now are threatening, or there's the threat they're going to collapse. You can try to, I mean, I don't think they were in favor of bailing them out, but we don't want to be lumped in with them. And the government threatened these better banks. Well, if you don't toe the government line, we're going to do things to you. And that's singling out companies. But that was in a real emergency situation. Trump does it routinely. It's his routine response to anything is to go after the person who's saying something he doesn't like, whether they're right or wrong, whether they have the freedoms to say it or not. It's his default reaction to take just of a different than tariffs and the economic issues in foreign policy. So the story in the last day or two about they were planning the Yemen attack on Signal, and they involved some of the top administration officials didn't know they had added a reporter from the Atlantic into this thread where they're talking about top secret things. And Trump's, when he was asked about it, his immediate thing was to go after the Atlantic. It's a failing magazine, and so that's the default reaction. And everybody, I think, around the administration and in business knows that's the default reaction. So whereas it happened more, some behind closed doors and some more in sort of crises and emergencies, it happens every time in regard to Trump. And so many of the stories say, well, they voiced some criticism, and some like, are you sure that this is a good economic policy? Won't this hurt the American economy? Won't this hurt the markets? Won't that be bad for you as president? That have voiced it behind closed doors. But to voice it publicly, that Trump has such a thin skin that that's the worst thing you could do to Trump, to sort of criticize or show a disloyalty in public. And whether they know that explicitly, they can sense that's the environment they're in. And so that they're scared to speak, again, I don't think should be surprising.
Yeah, one interesting concretization of what you're just talking about is back in the 2020 election, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife gave money to support voting infrastructure, not even to support an opposing candidate, but to set up ballot boxes. And of course, there was controversy about the role of ballot boxes in the 2020 election. Trump is incensed by this, outraged by Zuckerberg's donation, and publicly says, we are watching him closely, and if he does anything illegal this time, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. I mean, if that's not an overt threat of force based just on, not even on public criticism, but on supporting a cause that he doesn't like, I don't know what would be. And so is it any surprise then that when Trump comes to power in 2024, again, Zuckerberg goes to Mar-a-Lago and he makes nice, he donates to the inauguration, he attends the inauguration, and then, of course, gets criticized as being a plutocrat by the left for doing it, along with many other CEOs who were in similar position. But you have to think, well, is this just that he's reacting to these threats and that he's not actually the one who's in control, but that he is being manipulated by these politicians?
That's such a revealing case for various reasons. One is in addition to what you've said, if you've watched Zuckerberg talk about, okay, we're not going to fund those things anymore, he can't believe it. It's not as though he doesn't support what he used to support. He can't believe that it's the government comes after me for trying to just make our election system more efficient, more transparent, that we have more, we don't have a shortage of staff and so on. When you see him talk about it, he stopped doing it, but it's so clearly he stopped doing it because of the threats involved, not because he thinks, oh yeah, it was a mistake of what I was doing in the past. And the fact that he doesn't get public support, and here would be public support from more left-leaning people, that, yeah, this is something good and we should be supporting Zuckerberg. You can't find Democrats and left willing to support any kind of big business. They were part of the leaders in going after Facebook for other reasons. And so he has nowhere to turn. It's so clearly on one side, they hate us, it's seemingly for the fact that we're successful and productive and so have become big. And then on the other side of thinking, well, maybe they're in some sense Trump's sort of pro-business, but not in any real legitimate sense. And so it's just, you get the atmosphere, they're living in fear. And the idea that this is what it looks like to be in control, again, it just, you can't integrate those two things about him giving up things he clearly believes in and thinking, yeah, he's in control and sort of dictating what's happening.
I think the most plausible case, and I still don't think it's too plausible, that you could make for, it's really the businessmen who are in control, is the fact that, yes, some of these companies, some of these CEOs are hoping that something that the president is going to do is going to deregulate their industries, free them from regulations of the past administration. And indeed, there were all kinds of ways in which the previous administration, the Biden administration, put all kinds of unnecessary and unjust burdens on these business people. And they're hoping to get some relief under Trump. And so you can understand why they might not want to criticize him now on other matters when this lifeline to their business has now been opened. But of course, the fact that there's now this lifeline means that someone like Trump is holding it. And so even if he does offer them some escape, it's another form of control that he has over them, that he can relinquish this lifeline if he wants to, if they speak out against him. And so it's not a case where they're in control. It's still not a case where they're in control. They're still at the mercy of somebody who maybe on a good day is going to do them a favor, but not if they speak out, not if they say the wrong thing. And this is a good opportunity now to share a quotation that I wanted to share from Ayn Rand. And I'll just go ahead and read it straight without saying who she's talking about or when, but see if you can guess, and then I'll tell you at the end. She wrote, "You have now seen this in practice, in a cruder, more cynically obvious practice than I would have ventured to predict. The president was threatening the steel companies with retaliation by means of antitrust prosecutions, grand jury investigations, Senate and House committee investigations, Department of Justice investigations, Federal Trade Commission investigation, the reconsidering of tax legislation favorable to industry, etc. So long as a government holds discretionary powers to dispense punishments or favors, who will ever be able to prove or to know what goes on behind the scenes of any clash between government and private citizens? Is this a government of laws and not of men? No. Congress never passed any law giving the president the power to dictate prices and wages, but it passed many non-objective laws which gave him the power to make legality obsolete." That, of course, is Ayn Rand writing in June of 1962. She is talking about the administration of John F. Kennedy, the Democrat. Now, if you know anything about Ayn Rand's commentary on JFK, you know that one of the things she's notorious for is having thought of JFK as a kind of proto-fascist, or just plain fascist for that matter. She described his signature policy agenda as the new fascist frontier. And really, you have to think about it. If she thought this behavior on behalf of JFK was fascistic, the way he bullies the steel industry with various non-objective regulations, the way he threatens them with various investigations, and to remove various privileges if they don't comply with his demands for setting prices in certain ways in 1962. If she thought he was being fascistic about that, and most people don't think about JFK in that way. They don't know about this aspect of his presidency. What do you suppose she might think about a president who's done the kinds of things that we've talked about today? And of course, can't speak for her. She's not been around for a while, but this, to me, has all the kinds of parallels to the case she was criticizing. And if nothing else, it's even a stronger case of that. And last thing I'll say about this quotation is the end of it mentions the various powers that were granted by Congress to the president, making legality obsolete. And of course, one thing to say is that all of the same kinds of laws, including the antitrust laws, tax laws that she's bemoaning in this passage, still exist today, and they still have that power. They still grant that kind of unfettered power to the president. But it's not just that. There's even more, because we've talked a lot today about the role of tariffs in intimidating and shackling business, and the exact same thing applies to the situation between Congress and the president today. There are all kinds of emergency powers that Congress has granted to the president, various sections of U.S. code which give him power to impose tariffs for so-called national security purposes, when there's a quote-unquote large and serious balance of payment deficit, when there are quote surges of imports harming U.S. industry, when there's quote discriminatory tariff practices, all undefined criteria, which the president is now invoking. Adding to that, a 1977 International Economic Powers Act, which was to, quote, address unusual and extraordinary threats if the president declares a national emergency. The president is currently cashing in on all of this legislation, all of this open-ended, non-objective legislation, where Congress has basically surrendered its constitutional power to lay and levy tariffs and taxes to the president at his discretion. And so it's no wonder that he's now able to impose and threaten various forms of force at the drop of a hat and leave the business community cowed.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I'm thinking of the impact on the business community. The more and more the government wields power over the economy, and so over the producers in the economy, it becomes more and more difficult for the producers to operate. One thing that they try to do is to curry favor with the government. And this is part of what you can clearly see it happening with tariffs, of trying to get exemptions to this, or lowering the amount of the tariff. So pleading and lobbying with government, when you give government this kind of power over business and over the production, the natural and to be expected and logical consequence is that producers will now find that I have to lobby. If I'm going to try to have a long-term profitable company, I've got to try to minimize and shape the controls in such a way that they don't destroy my business. And real businessmen, real producers find this unsavory to do this. But they find, like, now I have to do this. It's part of what happens in Atlas Shrugged, and there's real parallels to that in the contemporary world, in the business world. In Atlas Shrugged, it's people like Hank Reardon in Industrials doesn't have a Washington man, and then it's, oh, you need one? Okay, I'll have one, but I don't want to look too much about what they do because it's all unsavory, doesn't seem related to production, it's just defensive. Why do I need such a person? And the tech industry was like this until the government went after Microsoft in the late 90s into the 2000s. And then it was, and Microsoft and Gates have said this publicly many times, it was, yeah, we didn't have any lobbying, and that was a mistake. And then, yeah, after that, we had lobbying, and we're trying to influence government. And this is not what it looks like for businessmen to want to take control of the government. It is defensive. But it is true that once you have this kind of system, and Ayn Rand called it a mixed economy, a mixture of freedom and controls, with the controls ever growing. Once you have that, you invite, in effect, people into the business world who are less concerned with production and building and so on, and more concerned with the manipulation of favors, and they're not productive people, they're manipulators. And is there an atmosphere around the whole Trump administration and what they talk about of the first Trump administration? He was surrounded more with people who were trying to check him would criticize them. They've talked, and it's true, that businessmen in the first term were more willing to criticize Trump than they are now. Well, that kind of evolution is you push out the better people, just as we've seen it in the Republican Party. The better people, a person like Paul Ryan is pushed out, and you get him. I mean, some of the people in Congress, like Green, Marjorie Taylor Greene. You see, like, that's a real decaying of who you have as in Congress. And Paul Ryan, whatever his faults, is like light years above her. And you see the same in the business world and the people around Trump. You get more and more people who, yeah, like, I like tariffs because I can use them to go after my competitors or shield my industry from newcomers coming in, because I might be able to cope with a 15% tariff I'm now established, but the newcomer trying to do this and dealing with the uncertainty, like if he loses one contract because now tariffs have made it that this we can't go through, this is not profitable, it can destroy his business. And so there are people, and I mean, this is widely reported on, that once you have tariffs and these kinds of subsidies and controls, they're hard to get rid of because they create a kind of concentrated lobby group that says, yeah, okay, we can operate with this, and we can do this because we're good at manipulating the government and winning favors. And that is a disaster. If you think about, well, what business is about production. If you're driving out the producers and inviting in the bootlickers, that long term, in thinking like the American business is going to thrive, that's not what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think what your last comment brings out is that if there's a germ of truth to the idea that there can be such a thing as a plutocracy or rule by businessmen, the germ of truth is the system we're under right now encourages rule by loser businessmen, rule by the ones who are uncompetitive, who don't want to have to compete on a free market, who want to gain political power over their rivals. But then the reason it's only a germ of truth and not the full truth is that they are then ruling over their competitors. They are then ruling over the other actually productive business people. And of course, it's not just them. It's them with the assistance of various cultural, intellectual supporters. And that's just when you have a Republican administration. Obviously, when you've got one on the left, it's not even close to looking like a plutocracy because, of course, they have so much explicit anti-business sentiment. But either way, what you have in either situation is where business people are not the rulers, they're the pawns. They are caught in terrible dilemmas, manipulated by politicians of whichever stripe, and we all pay the price for it. We all suffer for it, whether with greater prices at the grocery store or further erosion of other freedoms. And so, Onkar, I think the question that we should begin to wrap up with is, what is to be done? How can business, how should it respond? How can it respond? And to get that conversation started, I want to share something that came out from that same professor from Yale, Professor Sonnenfeld, the one who ran that business meeting, the meeting with CEOs, the morning before the meeting with Trump. Subsequently, he actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times describing the situation, offering his own thoughts as to what should be done. And first, start by noting something very interesting coming out of this op-ed, which is a kind of concession that you don't normally see op-eds in the New York Times making. And I'll quote, "American companies spent decades developing multinational operations relying on a web of economic trade agreements that fortified post-war America as the envy of the world. Much of that system is now in doubt. The self-interest of American business has been awakened." So how's this a concession? Wow, it's actually some sympathy. It's an expression of sympathy for business leaders, as though they are human beings who have made heroic efforts to create value, and not suddenly the plutocrats who are ruling over our lives, pleading with them to try to push back. It's nice that a piece in the New York Times should suddenly appreciate this. But what is his prescription? The title of the piece had to do with the need for business people to stand up. What is his idea of standing up? Here again, I quote, Chief executives must urgently lobby the administration and legislatures, individually and collectively, in closed-door meetings and publicly, to emphasize the negative consequences of these policies in terms that resonate with Mr. Trump, the potential long-term declines in their company's market value. Now, he's mentioning both backdoor and public commentary. I wish he had gone further. I think there's more that you can say. Now, to the point of a backdoor negotiation, I think you have to acknowledge that these business leaders are, in fact, operating under force. They're operating under actual force, under threats of force. And whenever that's the case, it's never obvious what they should do. And part of the problem with force is that it paralyzes thinking, puts you in impossible situations. And sometimes it means, you may have to try to lobby, bribe, flatter, appease your destroyers, which in effect means paying ransom to a kind of hostage taker. You don't have a choice. But at the same time, you have to remember that what you're doing is you're paying ransom to a hostage taker. And so you have to remember that empowers them. It gives them greater ability to continue to do it to you in the future. And so I'm glad at least there's some acknowledgement of the need to stand up publicly. I wish there were more. I wish more thought leaders would be encouraging business leaders to stand up in a more meaningful and public way. Either do it verbally and publicly, or maybe before stocks crash to 30% below, or at least pay someone who's willing to do it for you. You have thoughts on this, Onkar?
Yes. So the more businessmen would speak out for themselves, and I think speak out for their companies and their industries, but more broadly, the more they would speak out for freedom, the freedom for economic freedom for themselves as producers, but for every producer, the more that issue would gain traction in American culture. That unless the victims themselves stand up for themselves and say, we disapprove of the way we're being treated, and we think it's unjust, we think it's evil, and we will no longer accept it as sort of just the status quo, taken for granted, businessman is always a villain, always to be criticized. The more the victim stands up for themselves, the more it gains kind of cultural traction, cultural awareness of, really, is there some injustice here that's going on? And particularly to exhibit the injustice, the more often businesses would speak up on behalf of other businesses and other companies, including competitors, of saying, like we're in competition with them, but they still should be free. They should not be shackled with controls and with tariffs and with threats. The more that happened, the more the American public and just the average American citizen would think, maybe this business is really on the side of more freedom. And if America is about freedom, like maybe that's something I should support. And it's not some sort of narrow calculation of trying to lobby and manipulate. What they're trying to do is get the exemption to the tariffs, and so they'll be able to profit, and their competitors will still be paying the tariff, so they'll outcompete their competitors. The more they get the sense that's what's going on, the more it's, you don't really care about freedom, whatever you say about it. And so if, for instance, when the government went after Microsoft, if other companies in the tech industry had said, we're finding it hard to compete with Microsoft right now because they're so good, but it's not an issue of, they need to be broken up with antitrust, versus what many businesses did was pile on to the antitrust lawsuit and egg it on. Then nobody can take seriously that, but now you don't like controls or tariffs because they're damaging you, not your competitors, or not the businesses in other industries that you don't care so much about. So what it would really mean to stand up for themselves, it's stand up for their own companies, their own industries, but more widely and abstractly for the freedom of American businesses to operate without constant threat from the government. So like there's no long-term solution, I think, absent more and more businesses and business people being willing to do that. But on the side of just the average American citizen, the more you stand up in support of the freedom of American businesses and oppose controls, whoever's trying to impose them or threatening them, whether a Democrat, Republican, whether it's Biden, Trump, if you actually stand up for it, you're giving the business people some element of support and hopefully some encouragement for them to speak up. And go back to what it was reported that some of the CEOs said that, well, if stocks fell 20% or if stocks fell 30%, or I mean, similar things, if we go into a recession, so then I might be more willing to speak up publicly against, well, tariffs or one of the things that are really damaging us. Why would they be more willing to do that? Because presumably, like, what does it matter with the level of the stock market or when it's because presumably they would have some more public support. Now, if you criticize it, it's you're criticizing Trump, but we love Trump, and we're going to go after you. We're going to boycott your company, or we're going to ask Trump to impose tariffs that specifically hurt you. They have a sense like if I speak up, no one's going to support me. So all they can see is it's going to be damage or potential damage. If the stock market's tanked or we're in a recession, then it's people might say, yeah, maybe there's something to this, and they'll get some public support. And that's part of the value of giving public support to what you should do. And the more there was an atmosphere, whereas if they spoke up against the destructiveness of tariffs, they get some support, not it would be the whole MAGA crowd descending on them, the more it will happen, that some businessmen will have the courage to do it. So it's true that businessmen have to stand up for themselves, but it's not true that until they do that, there's nothing that citizens can do, because citizens, in effect, can, well, one, speak out about the injustice and therefore encourage businessmen themselves to speak up, because they have then some idea, yeah, I might get some public support if I do
that. Yeah, it reminds me, there's a scene in Atlas Shrugged where Reardon is on trial for the deal that he makes with Danaher, and he gives a speech in defense of himself at the end of the trial, and he's acquitted, and a number of private citizens come up to him afterwards to privately encourage him, but they hadn't stood up publicly. One of them says, "Can't you save us, Mr. Reardon? They're eating us alive, and it's no use fooling anybody about how it's the rich that they're after. Do you know what's happening to us?" And well, it would be nice if she had said this, and she and others like her had said this kind of thing publicly, including the part about how it's clearly a myth that it's the rich who are after us. Is this one of the things we've underscored, is how this news really gives the lie to the idea that there's this plutocracy in charge. If anything, it's the opposite. It's true. So I thought we would wrap up with some resources to share with our audience. First of all, the essay that I quoted from, The Public Interest C'est Moi, that was an article Ayn Rand wrote for the Objectivist newsletter in June of 1962. That essay is not available online, but you can now buy a paperback copy of the Objectivist newsletter on Amazon, and we'll include a link in the program notes for that. There is Ayn Rand's essay, America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business, where she really lays down her fundamental case for why it is that American businessmen are not plutocrats, but actually a persecuted minority. You can read this in her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. We have the audio of her lecture version of it online. We'll soon be putting the text version of this one online. And also a lecture that you gave, Onkar, Freedom and the Need for Business to Stand Up for Itself. This is on our YouTube channel, where you, I think, double down on some of the themes that you talked about today. And last of all, this is a link to the Substack page for the Atlas Circle, which is a new project by the Ayn Rand Institute. Onkar, did you want to say a word or two what the Atlas Circle is about?
Well, it's about forming real partnerships with businessmen who are interested in the issue of freedom for business, of restoring freedom in America, and that it needs this combination of intellectuals leading with intellectual content in support of business, in support of business freedom, in support of the productiveness that business sort of instantiates. But then business itself being willing to speak up in favor of American ideals. So it's this union of the intellectual and the businessman is what the Atlas Circle is about.
So it's everything we've talked about today that needs to be happening, and we are trying to lead the way on that. That's the atlascircle.substack.com. Please check it out. So if you're watching today, you liked what we gave you, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube, click the bell to get notifications, like, comment, share, whether you're on YouTube or anywhere else. Send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org if you have questions or suggestions for future episodes. We read everything that comes in. Thanks for having this conversation with me today, Onkar. I'm sure we will be delivering more like this in the future.